The morning sun cast long shadows across the Marine Corps training grounds as Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform for what felt like the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cool Virginia air, but from the weight of expectations that seemed to crush down on her shoulders. At 19, she was one of only 12 women in a cohort of 250 cadets at the prestigious Marine Officer Candidate School. The statistics alone were enough to make anyone nervous, but Sarah carried an additional burden that none of her fellow cadets could see. Growing up in a small town in New Mexico, Sarah had always been different. While other girls her age were interested in makeup and dating, she spent her afternoons fixing cars with her father and dreaming of serving her country. Her father, Miguel, had been a Marine himself, though his service had ended abruptly due to an injury sustained during his second deployment. He never talked much about his time in the Corps, but Sarah could see the pride in his eyes whenever he looked at his old dress blue uniform hanging in the closet. The decision to join the Marines hadn't been easy. Sarah's mother, Elena, had begged her to consider other options. "Mija, you're so smart," she would say, tears in her eyes. "You could be a doctor, a lawyer, anything you want. Why do you want to put yourself through this?" But Sarah's mind was made up. She had watched her father struggle with the regret of not completing his service, and she was determined to honor both his legacy and her own calling. The first few weeks at Officer Candidate School had been a blur of physical training, academic instruction, and constant evaluation. Sarah quickly realized that being a woman in this environment meant every mistake was magnified, every success scrutinized. When male cadets struggled with a particular exercise or failed to meet a standard, it was seen as an individual shortcoming. When Sarah or any of the other women faced similar challenges, whispers would follow about whether women belonged in combat roles at all. The physical demands were intense, but Sarah had prepared herself well. Years of cross-country running and weightlifting had given her a solid foundation, and she consistently scored in the top 20% on fitness tests. What she hadn't prepared for was the psychological warfare that came with being constantly watched, constantly judged, and constantly having to prove herself worthy of the title she sought to earn. Staff Sergeant Williams was her primary instructor, a career Marine with 22 years of service and the demeanor of someone who had seen everything the Corps could throw at him. He was fair, but demanding, pushing every cadet to their limits regardless of gender. Sarah respected him, even when his corrections stung, because she knew they came from a place of wanting to make her better, not break her down. The trouble began during the third week, during a particularly challenging field exercise. The cadets had been divided into small teams and given a complex tactical scenario to solve under time pressure. Sarah's team was struggling with their approach when she noticed a flaw in their plan that could potentially lead to failure of the mission. She spoke up, suggesting an alternative route that would better utilize their available resources and minimize exposure to enemy fire. Her teammate, Cadet Thompson, immediately dismissed her suggestion. "We don't have time for your ideas, Martinez," he said, not even looking at her as he spoke. "Let's stick with the original plan." The other male cadets in her group nodded in agreement, and Sarah felt her face flush with frustration. She knew her idea was sound. She had studied the terrain carefully and had experience with similar tactical problems from her ROTC training. But she also knew that pushing too hard would label her as difficult to work with. The exercise proceeded with the original plan, and as Sarah had predicted, her team failed to complete their objective within the time limit. During the after-action review, Staff Sergeant Williams asked each team to identify what had gone wrong and what they could have done differently. When Sarah's team presented their analysis, she made the difficult decision to remain silent about her earlier suggestion, not wanting to throw her teammates under the bus or appear to be making excuses. But the pattern had been established. In subsequent exercises, Sarah found that her ideas and suggestions were routinely dismissed by her male peers. It didn't matter that her academic scores were consistently high or that she excelled in physical fitness. When it came to leadership scenarios and tactical discussions, she was treated as an afterthought, her contributions overlooked or ignored entirely. The situation came to a head during week 6, when cadets were being evaluated for their potential leadership assignments for the final phase of training. These assignments were crucial. They would determine not only whether a cadet graduated, but also what kind of position they might be offered upon commissioning as an officer. Sarah had been hoping for a chance to serve as a squad leader or at least an assistant, positions that would allow her to demonstrate her capabilities and prove that she belonged. When the assignments were posted, Sarah's name was nowhere to be found on the leadership roster. Instead, she had been assigned to what was essentially a support role, responsible for logistics coordination and equipment management. It was important work, but it was also the kind of position that would keep her in the background, away from the high-visibility leadership opportunities that could make or break a Marine officer's career. Sarah stared at the assignment board for a long moment, feeling a familiar, knot form in her stomach. Around her, other cadets were celebrating their assignments or commiserating with friends who hadn't gotten what they wanted. But Sarah stood alone, processing the reality that despite her strong performance in every measurable category, she was being sidelined into a role that felt like a dead end. That evening, Sarah sat in her barracks room, staring at a letter from her father that had arrived that afternoon. In his careful handwriting, he had written about how proud he was of her progress and how he couldn't wait to see her graduate and earn her commission. The words that had been meant to encourage her now felt like weights around her chest, reminding her of all the expectations she was failing to meet. Her roommate, Jennifer Park, was one of the other women in the program, and she could see the distress written across Sarah's face. "What's going on?" Jennifer asked gently, sitting down on her own bunk across from Sarah. Sarah explained the situation, her voice barely above a whisper to avoid being overheard by cadets in neighboring rooms. Jennifer listened without judgment, nodding occasionally as Sarah described the pattern of dismissal and marginalization she had been experiencing. "I keep telling myself that I just need to work harder, be better," Sarah said, finally, letting some of the frustration she had been holding inside spill out. "But it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. They see me as a diversity hire, not as a real candidate for leadership." Jennifer was quiet for a moment before responding. "You know that's not true, right? Your scores speak for themselves. You're in the top 10% of our class academically, and you've never failed a physical fitness test. The problem isn't your performance, it's their perception." The words were meant to be comforting, but they only made Sarah feel more frustrated. If the problem was perception rather than performance, how could she possibly fix it? She couldn't change the fact that she was a woman, and she was beginning to wonder if that would always be an insurmountable obstacle in the Marine Corps, despite official policies about equal opportunity and merit-based advancement. The next few days passed in a blur of routine training and exercises, but Sarah found it increasingly difficult to maintain her usual focus and enthusiasm. During physical training, she went through the motions mechanically, her mind elsewhere. In academic sessions, she took notes dutifully, but found herself questioning whether any of it mattered if she was destined to be relegated to support roles regardless of her capabilities. It was during this period of doubt and introspection that Sarah first encountered Gunnery Sergeant Rebecca "Gunny" Torres. Gunny Torres was a legend in the Marine Corps, a woman who had broken barriers and shattered expectations throughout her 15-year career. She had served in combat zones, led Marines in some of the most challenging environments on Earth, and earned the respect of her peers through her competence, courage, and unwavering commitment to the Corps' values. Gunny Torres was visiting the Officer Candidate School as part of a mentorship program designed to connect promising cadets with experienced Marines who could provide guidance and perspective. Sarah had heard about the program, but hadn't expected to be selected for participation, given her recent assignment to a support role. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and Sarah approached it with a mixture of nervousness and skepticism. She had been disappointed by authority figures before, and she wasn't sure what to expect from this encounter. Would Gunny Torres simply offer platitudes about persistence and hard work, or would she provide genuine insight into how to navigate the challenges Sarah was facing? When Sarah arrived at the designated meeting room, she found Gunny Torres reviewing a file that Sarah assumed contained her performance records and evaluations. The gunnery sergeant was smaller in stature than Sarah had expected, but there was something about her presence that filled the room, an aura of confidence and competence that was immediately apparent. Gunny Torres looked up as Sarah entered and snapped to attention. "At ease, Cadet Martinez," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command but without the harsh edge that characterized many of Sarah's instructors. "Please, have a seat. I've been looking forward to this conversation." Sarah sat down carefully, maintaining her military bearing while trying to read Gunny Torres' expression for any clues about the purpose of this meeting. Was this some kind of counseling session designed to encourage her to reconsider her career path? Or was it a genuine opportunity for mentorship and guidance? "I've been reviewing your file," Gunny Torres began, tapping the folder with her finger. "Impressive academic performance, excellent physical fitness scores, strong performance in individual tasks and exercises. Yet you've been assigned to a logistics coordination role for the final phase of training. Help me understand how those things align. The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard. She had expected to be asked about her goals or her motivations for joining the Marine Corps, not to be questioned about the apparent disconnect between her performance and her assignment. I'm not sure they do align, Gunnery Sergeant, Sarah replied carefully. I've been trying to figure out what I need to do differently to earn a leadership position. Gunny Torres leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with sharp, intelligent eyes. Tell me about your experience here so far. Not the official version you'd give to an instructor, but what it's really been like for you. Something in Gunny Torres' tone encouraged honesty, and Sarah found herself opening up about the pattern of dismissal and marginalization she had experienced. She talked about having her ideas ignored in team exercises, about feeling like she had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition, and about the growing sense that no matter how well she performed, she would always be seen as an outsider in the Marine Corps. As Sarah spoke, Gunny Torres listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making brief notes. When Sarah finished, there was a moment of silence before the gunnery sergeant responded. Everything you've just described is familiar to me, Gunny Torres said quietly. I went through similar experiences when I was coming up through the ranks. The difference is that when I was a young Marine, there weren't many women in leadership positions who could provide guidance or perspective on these challenges. Sarah felt a spark of recognition and relief. Here was someone who understood what she was going through, someone who had faced similar obstacles and had obviously overcome them. The question is, Gunny Torres continued, what are you going to do about it? You can let these experiences define you and limit your potential, or you can use them as motivation to prove that you belong here and that you're capable of leading Marines, regardless of what some people might think. The words hit Sarah like a challenge, and an invitation rolled into one. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of the determination that had brought her to officer candidate school in the first place. But even as that spark of hope flickered to life, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if individual determination would be enough to overcome the institutional and cultural barriers she was facing. The challenges ahead seemed enormous, and the path forward was far from clear. What she didn't know was that her encounter with Gunny Torres was just the beginning of a transformation that would change not only her own perspective, but also her understanding of what it truly meant to be a Marine. The conversation with Gunny Torres lasted another hour, during which Sarah learned about the gunnery sergeant's own journey through the Marine Corps. The stories were both inspiring and sobering, painting a picture of a military culture that was slowly evolving but still struggling with deeply ingrained attitudes about women in combat roles. As the meeting concluded, Gunny Torres gave Sarah a piece of advice that would echo in her mind for days to come. Excellence is your best weapon against prejudice, but excellence alone isn't always enough. Sometimes you need allies, and sometimes you need to be willing to take risks to prove your point. The key is knowing when to do which. Sarah left that meeting with a renewed sense of purpose, but also with a growing awareness that the challenges ahead would require more than just individual effort. She would need strategy, allies, and, perhaps most importantly, the courage to take stands that might be uncomfortable or risky. What she couldn't have known was that the most important moment of her entire experience at officer candidate school was still to come, and that it would involve not Gunny Torres or any of the official mentors and instructors, but rather an unexpected ally who would emerge from the most unlikely of places. The foundations had been laid, the stage had been set, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover that sometimes the words that change everything come from sources you never see coming. The week following Sarah's meeting with Gunny Torres brought a renewed intensity to the training program. With only 4 weeks remaining before graduation, the pressure on all cadets had reached a fever pitch. The final phase exercises were designed to test everything they had learned, pushing them to their physical and mental limits while evaluating their potential as future Marine officers. Sarah threw herself into this new phase with determined focus, taking Gunny Torres' advice to heart. Excellence would be her weapon against prejudice, and she was determined to demonstrate that excellence in every possible way. During morning physical training, she pushed herself harder than ever, consistently finishing in the top 5 among all cadets. In academic sessions, she asked thoughtful questions and contributed meaningfully to discussions, even when she sensed resistance from some of her peers. The logistics coordination role she had been assigned turned out to be more complex and challenging than she had initially anticipated. Sarah found herself responsible for managing equipment distribution, coordinating transportation schedules, and ensuring that all training scenarios had the necessary resources to proceed smoothly. It was detail-oriented work that required exceptional organizational skills and the ability to anticipate problems before they occurred. What surprised Sarah was how much she enjoyed the strategic thinking required by her assignment. She began to see patterns in how different exercises were structured and started developing more efficient systems for resource allocation. Her innovations didn't go unnoticed by Staff Sergeant Williams, who began relying on her recommendations for optimizing training schedules and equipment usage. However, Sarah's success in her assigned role also came with an unexpected downside. The better she performed in logistics coordination, the more she was pigeonholed into that type of work. When opportunities arose for cadets to rotate through different leadership positions, Sarah found herself consistently passed over in favor of maintaining stability in the logistics operations she had been managing so effectively. The irony was not lost on her. Her competence was being used as a justification for limiting her opportunities rather than expanding them. She was too valuable in her current role to be moved to a position where she could demonstrate her leadership potential. It was a classic catch-22 situation that left her feeling trapped despite her strong performance. During this period, Sarah began to pay closer attention to the dynamics among her fellow cadets. She noticed that the male cadets who had been assigned to leadership positions weren't necessarily performing better than she was in their roles, but they were getting valuable experience that would serve them well in their future Marine careers. Meanwhile, she was becoming an expert in logistics coordination, which was important but didn't carry the same prestige or career advancement potential as tactical leadership experience. One particular incident crystallized Sarah's growing frustration with the situation. During a complex field exercise that involved multiple teams working together to achieve a common objective, there was a critical breakdown in communication that threatened to derail the entire operation. Sarah, monitoring the situation from her logistics coordination post, could see exactly what was going wrong and knew how to fix it. The problem stemmed from a misunderstanding about resource allocation between two of the tactical teams. Team Alpha believed they were supposed to receive additional ammunition supplies at a specific checkpoint, while Team Bravo was under the impression that they were responsible for providing those same supplies to Team Alpha. The confusion had created a standoff that was burning valuable time and preventing both teams from completing their assigned tasks. From her position, Sarah could see the entire battlefield layout and had access to the original resource allocation plans. She knew exactly where the miscommunication had occurred and had a clear solution that would get both teams back on track. But her role as logistics coordinator didn't officially give her the authority to intervene in tactical operations, even when she could see that intervention was desperately needed. Sarah watched the situation deteriorate for several minutes, hoping that one of the assigned team leaders would identify and address the problem. When it became clear that wasn't going to happen, she faced a difficult decision. She could stay within the bounds of her assigned role and watch the exercise fail, or she could take initiative and risk overstepping her authority to salvage the mission. The values that had brought her to the Marine Corps in the first place made the choice for her. Sarah contacted both team leaders via radio and quickly explained the source of the confusion, providing them with the correct information needed to resolve the resource allocation problem. Her intervention was successful. Both teams were able to complete their objectives within the allotted time frame, and the overall exercise was deemed a success. However, Sarah's unauthorized intervention in tactical operations didn't go unnoticed. After the exercise concluded, she was summoned to meet with Captain Richardson, the officer in charge of the final phase training program. Captain Richardson was a by-the-books Marine with a reputation for strict adherence to protocol and chain of command. The meeting took place in Captain Richardson's office, a Spartan room decorated with Marine Corps memorabilia and photos from various deployments. Sarah stood at attention as Captain Richardson reviewed the after-action reports from the exercise, his expression unreadable. Cadet Martinez, Captain Richardson began, his voice measured and professional. Your intervention during today's exercise was effective in achieving the mission objective. However, it also represented a clear violation of your assigned role and responsibilities. As logistics coordinator, you are not authorized to provide tactical guidance to team leaders unless specifically requested to do so. Sarah felt her heart sink. She had known that her actions might be viewed as overstepping her bounds, but she had hoped that the positive outcome would outweigh any concerns about protocol violations. Sir, I understand that I exceeded my assigned authority, Sarah replied carefully. However, I could see that the mission was failing due to a simple communication error that was within my ability to resolve. I felt that my duty to the success of the overall operation took precedence over strict adherence to my limited role. Captain Richardson studied her for a moment before responding. Your instincts regarding the tactical situation were correct, and your intervention was indeed effective. However, the Marine Corps operates on a foundation of discipline and respect for authority. When Marines begin making independent decisions about when and how to exceed their assigned roles, it undermines the entire command structure that keeps us effective in combat situations. The lecture continued for several more minutes, with Captain Richardson explaining the importance of staying within assigned roles and following proper channels for reporting problems or concerns. Sarah listened respectfully, but internally she felt frustrated by what seemed like a system designed to discourage initiative and punish success that didn't conform to rigid expectations. As the meeting concluded, Captain Richardson delivered what felt like the final blow. Given this incident, I have concerns about your judgment regarding appropriate boundaries and authority structures. This will be noted in your evaluation file and will be considered when making recommendations for your post-graduation assignments. Sarah left Captain Richardson's office feeling deflated and angry. She had successfully salvaged a failing exercise and ensured that all teams were able to complete their training objectives. But instead of being praised for her initiative and problem-solving abilities, she was being penalized for not following protocol strictly enough. The message seemed clear. Her value as a future Marine officer was less important than her compliance with existing power structures. That evening, Sarah found herself walking alone around the base, trying to process her emotions and figure out her next steps. The physical activity helped clear her mind, and gradually her anger began to transform into a more analytical assessment of her situation. She realized that her encounter with Captain Richardson had revealed something important about the institutional culture she was trying to join. The Marine Corps, like any large organization, had multiple competing values and priorities. On one hand, it valued initiative, leadership, and mission accomplishment, the very qualities that had led Sarah to intervene in the failing exercise. On the other hand, it valued discipline, respect for authority, and adherence to established procedures, the qualities that Captain Richardson had emphasized in their meeting. The tension between these competing values created a complex environment where success required not just competence and good judgment, but also a sophisticated understanding of when and how to navigate the informal rules and expectations that govern behavior. Sarah began to realize that her challenges went beyond simple gender discrimination. They were also related to her relative inexperience with the cultural nuances of military life. This insight led her to a new strategy. Instead of simply trying to prove herself through excellent individual performance, she needed to better understand the social and political dynamics of the Marine Corps culture. She needed to build relationships with people who could help her navigate these complexities and advocate for her when opportunities arose. With this new perspective, Sarah began to pay closer attention to the informal networks and relationships among the training staff and experienced Marines she encountered. She noticed that certain instructors seemed to have more influence than others, and that there were unspoken alliances and rivalries that affected how decisions were made and how cadets were evaluated. One person who particularly intrigued Sarah was Lance Corporal Marcus Thompson, a young Marine who served as an assistant instructor in the program. Thompson was unusual among the training staff because he was close in age to the cadets and had only recently completed officer candidate school himself. Despite his junior rank, he seemed to have earned the respect of the senior instructors through his competence and his ability to connect with struggling cadets. Sarah had observed Thompson during various training exercises and had been impressed by his teaching style and his genuine concern for cadet development. Unlike some of the other instructors who seemed primarily focused on identifying weaknesses and failures, Thompson appeared committed to helping cadets improve and succeed. During a particularly challenging navigation exercise, Sarah had the opportunity to work more closely with Lance Corporal Thompson when several cadets in her group became lost and disoriented in the dense Virginia wilderness. Thompson had been assigned to monitor the exercise and provide guidance when safety concerns arose, and he ended up working with Sarah to locate and redirect the lost cadets. What struck Sarah about the experience was Thompson's leadership approach. Rather than simply telling the cadets what they were doing wrong, he asked questions that helped them figure out their mistakes for themselves. He provided guidance and support without undermining their confidence or making them feel incompetent. The key to good navigation isn't just knowing how to use your compass and map, Thompson explained to one struggling cadet. It's about constantly checking your position and being willing to admit when you've made a mistake and need to correct course. Pride will get you more lost than poor map reading skills ever will. After the exercise concluded successfully, Thompson made a point of acknowledging Sarah's contributions to the rescue effort. "Good work out there, Martinez," he said quietly as they prepared to return to base. "Your systematic approach to searching and your ability to keep the team focused made all the difference in finding those lost cadets quickly." The praise meant more to Sarah than she expected it to. It was the first time in weeks that someone in authority had specifically recognized her leadership capabilities rather than just her technical skills or compliance with instructions. The interaction left her wondering whether Lance Corporal Thompson might be someone who could provide the kind of perspective and guidance she needed to navigate the challenges she was facing. However, Sarah was also aware that seeking mentorship or advice from Thompson could be complicated by both rank considerations and potential gender dynamics. As a Lance Corporal, Thompson was junior to many of the other instructors, and Sarah wasn't sure how much real influence he had within the program. Additionally, she had learned to be cautious about relationships with male Marines that could be misinterpreted or used against her by those looking for reasons to question her professionalism or commitment. These considerations weighed on Sarah's mind as she continued through the demanding final weeks of the program. The training intensity had reached its peak, with cadets facing a continuous series of challenging exercises designed to test their physical endurance, mental resilience, and leadership potential under extreme stress. During this period, Sarah's performance remained consistently strong across all measure categories. Her physical fitness scores were excellent, her academic work was exemplary, and her logistics coordination responsibilities were being executed flawlessly. Yet she continued to feel like she was operating on the periphery of the real leadership development that was taking place around her. The other women in the program were facing similar challenges, though each was handling the situation differently. Jennifer Park had adopted a strategy of keeping her head down and focusing solely on meeting all stated requirements, hoping that excellent performance would speak for itself. Maria Rodriguez had become increasingly assertive about advocating for herself, which had earned her some leadership opportunities but had also created tension with certain instructors who viewed her approach as pushy or demanding. Sarah found herself somewhere between these two approaches, trying to balance excellence with strategic thinking about how to position herself for success. The conversation with Gunny Torres had given her valuable perspective, but she still felt like she was missing some crucial piece of understanding about how to navigate the complex dynamics of Marine Corps culture. It was during this period of continued reflection and strategic thinking that Sarah began to notice something interesting about Lance Corporal Thompson's interactions with other instructors and staff members. Despite his junior rank, he seemed to command a level of respect that went beyond what his position would normally warrant. Senior instructors sought his opinion on cadet performance and training effectiveness, and he was frequently included in planning discussions that would typically be limited to more senior personnel. Sarah realized that Thompson's influence came not from his formal authority, but from his reputation for fairness, competence, and genuine dedication to cadet development. He had built credibility through his actions and his results, creating a form of informal leadership that transcended traditional rank structures. This observation gave Sarah new insight into how the Marine Corps really functioned beneath its formal hierarchy. While rank and position certainly mattered, true influence often came from demonstrated competence, integrity, and the ability to contribute meaningfully to the organization's mission. This understanding would prove to be crucial as Sarah approached the final challenges of her officer candidate school experience, though she had no way of knowing that her most important test was still to come. The final 2 weeks of officer candidate school arrived with an intensity that seemed to electrify the entire base. These culminating exercises would determine not only who would graduate and receive their commission as Marine officers, but also what kind of assignments and opportunities would be available to them upon entering active duty. For Sarah, the stakes felt impossibly high, carrying the weight of her own dreams as well as the expectations of everyone who had supported her journey to this point. The capstone exercise was announced as a 5-day field operation that would test every skill and capability the cadets had developed over the previous 10 weeks. Unlike previous exercises that had focused on specific competencies, this final challenge would present complex, evolving scenarios that required adaptability, leadership under pressure, and the ability to make sound decisions with incomplete information. What made the exercise particularly challenging was its structure. Rather than working in their usual assigned teams, cadets would be reorganized into new groups every day, forcing them to quickly establish working relationships with people they hadn't trained with extensively. Leadership roles would be rotated based on the specific requirements of each scenario, giving everyone opportunities to both lead and follow in different contexts. Sarah approached the announcement with mixed feelings. On one hand, the rotation system meant she would finally have opportunities to demonstrate her tactical leadership abilities rather than being confined to logistics support. On the other hand, she would be working with cadets who might not be familiar with her capabilities and who might bring the same preconceptions and biases that had limited her opportunities throughout the program. The first day of the exercise presented a humanitarian crisis scenario. The cadets were told that they were Marine officers responding to a natural disaster in a friendly foreign country, with responsibility for coordinating relief efforts while maintaining security in an unstable environment. Sarah found herself assigned to a team led by Cadet Johnson, one of the male cadets who had consistently dismissed her contributions in previous exercises. The scenario required the team to establish a secure perimeter around a refugee camp, while simultaneously coordinating the distribution of medical supplies and food to displaced civilians. It was exactly the kind of complex, multifaceted challenge that demanded both tactical competence and humanitarian sensitivity. Johnson's initial approach was to focus primarily on the security aspects of the mission, deploying team members in defensive positions around the camp while dedicating minimal resources to the humanitarian relief efforts. Sarah could see that this approach, while tactically sound from a purely military perspective, was missing the broader strategic picture of winning hearts and minds in a complex operational environment. When she attempted to suggest a more balanced approach that would better integrate security and humanitarian objectives, Johnson responded with familiar dismissiveness. "Martinez, I appreciate your concern about the civilian population, but our primary mission is security. We can worry about making friends after we've made sure nobody gets shot." Sarah felt the familiar frustration rising in her chest, but this time she was determined to handle the situation differently. Instead of simply accepting the dismissal, she decided to demonstrate the value of her perspective through action rather than argument. While Johnson focused on positioning team members for optimal security coverage, Sarah took the initiative to conduct a detailed assessment of the refugee camp's layout and the distribution of civilian populations. She identified several potential vulnerabilities in Johnson's security plan, including blind spots that could be exploited by hostile forces and bottlenecks that could create dangerous situations if civilians panic during an emergency. More importantly, Sarah developed an alternative approach that would achieve both security and humanitarian objectives more effectively. Her plan involved positioning team members in locations where they could provide security oversight, while also assisting with relief distribution, creating positive interactions with the civilian population that would generate valuable intelligence about potential threats. Rather than challenging Johnson's authority directly, Sarah implemented elements of her plan independently, positioning herself to assist with supply distribution while maintaining visual coverage of a critical security sector. Her approach allowed her to gather information about civilian concerns and potential security risks while building rapport that could prove valuable if the situation escalated. As the exercise progressed, the effectiveness of Sarah's integrated approach became apparent to the evaluating instructors. The team members following Johnson's traditional security-focused deployment were isolated from the civilian population and were missing important intelligence indicators that could have warned of developing problems. Meanwhile, Sarah's position allowed her to identify and report several significant issues, including the presence of armed individuals who were not part of the official security forces and signs of growing tension between different ethnic groups within the refugee population. When the exercise concluded, the after-action review highlighted the importance of balancing multiple mission objectives in complex operational environments. While Johnson's security plan was technically competent, the evaluators noted that it had missed several opportunities to gather valuable intelligence and build relationships that could have prevented future problems. Sarah's contributions were specifically mentioned in the evaluation, with Staff Sergeant Williams noting that her integrated approach had demonstrated superior understanding of the strategic context and had provided the team with capabilities that would not have been available under a purely security-focused deployment. The recognition felt validating, but Sarah was careful not to let it go to her head. She knew that one successful day in a 5-day exercise was not enough to fundamentally change how she was perceived or to guarantee future opportunities. However, the experience had given her increased confidence in her ability to contribute meaningfully to complex operations, and she was determined to build on that success throughout the remainder of the exercise. The second day presented a completely different challenge, a direct action mission against a simulated enemy position. This was exactly the kind of tactical scenario where traditional military thinking suggested that physical strength and aggressive leadership would be most important. Sarah found herself assigned to a team led by Cadet Maria Rodriguez, one of her fellow female cadets, creating an interesting dynamic where two women would be responsible for leading what was essentially a combat operation. Rodriguez had chosen an aggressive leadership style throughout the program, often pushing back against male cadets who attempted to dismiss or ignore her contributions. While this approach had earned her some leadership opportunities, it had also created tension and had led some instructors to question her ability to work collaboratively with her peers. For this mission, Rodriguez adopted a direct, authoritative approach to planning and execution. She assigned specific roles to each team member and made it clear that she expected immediate compliance with her orders. While this leadership style was effective in ensuring clear communication and coordinated action, Sarah noticed that it was also creating resentment among some of the male cadets who were not accustomed to taking orders from women. Sarah found herself in the challenging position of trying to support Rodriguez's leadership while also working to maintain team cohesion and effectiveness. She recognized that the success of the mission depended not just on tactical execution, but also on the team's ability to work together under pressure. During the planning phase, Sarah made subtle contributions that strengthened Rodriguez's plan while being careful not to appear to be challenging her authority. When Rodriguez proposed a frontal assault approach, Sarah asked questions about potential flanking routes that led the team to consider more sophisticated tactical options. When concerns were raised about ammunition allocation, Sarah provided logistics insights that helped optimize resource distribution. The mission execution was successful, with the team achieving all primary objectives within the designated time frame. However, the interpersonal dynamics had been strained throughout the operation, with several male team members expressing frustration about Rodriguez's leadership style during the after-action review. Sarah found herself in an uncomfortable position during this discussion. She wanted to support Rodriguez, who had faced many of the same challenges and biases that Sarah had experienced. At the same time, she recognized that some of the criticism being voiced had legitimate foundations, even if it was being influenced by gender-based assumptions about appropriate leadership behavior. The evaluating instructor, Captain Morrison, facilitated a discussion about different leadership styles and their effectiveness in various contexts. The conversation revealed interesting double standards in how assertive leadership was perceived when exhibited by male versus female cadets, but it also highlighted genuine areas where Rodriguez could improve her approach to team management. For Sarah, the day provided valuable lessons about the complexities of leadership in environments where gender dynamics intersected with operational requirements. She began to understand that successful leadership as a woman in the Marine Corps would require not just competence and confidence, but also sophisticated awareness of how her actions and communication style would be perceived and interpreted by others. The third day brought perhaps the most challenging scenario yet, a complex negotiation and peacekeeping operation that required delicate cultural sensitivity and diplomatic skill. The cadets were told they were Marine officers working with international partners to resolve a territorial dispute between two allied nations, with responsibility for maintaining peace while facilitating productive negotiations. This time, Sarah found herself assigned to a team led by Cadet Williams, a soft-spoken cadet who had consistently performed well in academic settings but had struggled with some of the more physically demanding aspects of the program. Williams had a thoughtful, analytical approach to problem-solving that Sarah respected, but he also had a tendency to become overwhelmed when faced with rapidly changing situations. The scenario presented exactly the kind of multifaceted challenge that played to Sarah's strengths. Her academic background in international relations, combined with her experience in logistics coordination and her growing understanding of tactical operations, gave her a unique perspective on how to approach the complex requirements of the mission. As the team began planning their approach, Sarah found Williams to be much more receptive to her input than previous team leaders had been. He actively sought her opinions on various aspects of the operation and incorporated her suggestions into the overall strategy. For the first time during officer candidate school, Sarah felt like she was truly functioning as a valued member of a leadership team rather than as a support player whose contributions were tolerated but not truly welcomed. The operation required the team to establish secure meeting locations for the negotiating parties while also gathering intelligence about the underlying causes of the territorial dispute. Sarah's suggestion to position team members as cultural liaisons who could interact with representatives from both sides proved to be crucial to the mission's success. Her approach allowed the team to identify several issues that were not apparent in the initial briefing materials, including historical grievances and economic factors that were complicating the territorial dispute. This intelligence enabled the team to develop more sophisticated strategies for facilitating productive negotiations and avoiding potential flashpoints that could derail the peace process. During the execution phase, Sarah found herself serving as the primary liaison with one of the negotiating parties, a role that required her to balance diplomatic sensitivity with the need to gather actionable intelligence. Her performance in this capacity was exemplary, earning praise from both the evaluating instructors and her team members. The success of the day's exercise was particularly meaningful for Sarah because it demonstrated her ability to excel in exactly the kind of complex, nuanced operations that she hoped to be involved in as a Marine officer. Unlike exercises that focused primarily on physical capabilities or traditional tactical skills, this scenario had required the kind of strategic thinking and cultural competence that Sarah felt represented her greatest potential contributions to the Marine Corps. As the exercise concluded, Williams made a point of publicly acknowledging Sarah's contributions during the after-action review. Martinez's insight into the cultural and economic factors driving this conflict was essential to our success, he said. Without her analysis, we would have been operating with incomplete information and probably would have made mistakes that could have escalated the situation. The recognition felt different from previous acknowledgments Sarah had received. Rather than being praised for supporting someone else's plan or for performing an assigned task competently, she was being recognized for leadership and strategic thinking that had directly contributed to mission success. However, Sarah was also aware that this positive experience had occurred under somewhat unique circumstances. Williams had been more open to her contributions than many other potential team leaders, and the nature of the scenario had aligned well with her particular strengths and interests. She knew that she couldn't assume that future opportunities would be similarly well suited to her capabilities or that other leaders would be equally receptive to her input. The fourth day presented yet another different challenge, a large-scale combat operation that required coordination between multiple teams working toward interconnected objectives. This was the kind of scenario that most closely resembled the traditional Marine Corps mission of aggressive offensive operations against hostile forces. Sarah found herself assigned to a team responsible for providing fire support to other units conducting the primary assault. It was an important role that required technical competence and precise coordination, but it was also a position that would keep her somewhat removed from the direct leadership challenges faced by the assault teams. The team leader for this exercise was Cadet Thompson, not Lance Corporal Marcus Thompson, but rather one of the male cadets who had been consistently dismissive of Sarah's contributions throughout the program. This Thompson had been assigned to several high-profile leadership positions and was widely regarded as one of the top candidates for a prestigious assignment upon graduation. Thompson's leadership style was characterized by confident decision-making and clear communication, but also by a tendency to micromanage and a reluctance to delegate meaningful authority to his subordinates. From the beginning of the planning process, it was clear that he intended to maintain tight control over all aspects of the operation. Sarah found herself assigned to coordinate ammunition supply for the fire support mission, a role that was technically challenging but that also limited her opportunities to contribute to tactical decision-making. As the planning progressed, she identified several potential issues with Thompson's approach, including ammunition allocation problems that could leave the team without adequate supplies at critical moments. When she attempted to raise these concerns, Thompson's response was predictably dismissive. "I appreciate your attention to detail, Martinez, but I've got the big picture under control. Just focus on your assigned responsibilities and let me worry about the overall strategy." The pattern felt depressingly familiar, but this time Sarah was determined to find a way to contribute meaningfully despite the constraints of her assigned role and Thompson's reluctance to consider her input. She began developing contingency plans for ammunition resupply that would address the potential shortfalls she had identified, even though these plans went beyond her officially assigned responsibilities. During the execution phase, Sarah's concerns proved to be well-founded. The fire support mission required more intensive ammunition usage than Thompson's original plan had anticipated, and the team began running low on critical supplies at exactly the moment when the assault teams needed maximum fire support to achieve their objectives. Without waiting for permission or authorization, Sarah implemented her contingency resupply plan, coordinating with logistics assets to ensure that additional ammunition was delivered to the fire support position before the shortage became critical. Her initiative prevented what could have been a mission failure and ensured that the assault teams received the support they needed to complete their objectives successfully. The after-action review for this exercise was particularly intense, with evaluators examining every aspect of the operation to identify lessons learned and areas for improvement. When the ammunition supply issue was discussed, Thompson attempted to take credit for the successful resupply operation, claiming that it had been part of his original planning all along. However, the evaluating instructors had been monitoring communications throughout the exercise and were aware of the actual sequence of events. Staff Sergeant Williams specifically asked Sarah to explain her role in resolving the ammunition shortage, giving her an opportunity to describe her analysis of the potential problem and the contingency planning she had developed to address it. The recognition was gratifying, but Sarah was also aware that her success had come at the cost of directly contradicting her team leader's authority. While the results had been positive, she knew that Thompson would not appreciate being shown up in front of the evaluating staff, and she wondered what consequences that might have for her final evaluations and post-graduation assignments. As the fourth day concluded, Sarah found herself reflecting on the complex dynamics that had characterized her experience throughout officer candidate school. Each successful demonstration of her capabilities seemed to come with new challenges and complications, and she was beginning to understand that excellence alone would not be sufficient to overcome all of the institutional and cultural barriers she was facing. However, she was also developing increasing confidence in her ability to contribute meaningfully to Marine operations, regardless of the formal constraints and limitations that others might try to impose on her. The experiences of the past few days had shown her that there were always ways to add value and make a difference, even when operating from positions that seemed to offer limited authority or influence. With one day remaining in the capstone exercise, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension about what final challenges awaited her. She had proven her capabilities across a wide range of scenarios and had demonstrated that she could succeed regardless of team composition or leadership dynamics. However, she was also aware that her most important test might still be ahead of her, and that the words and actions that would ultimately define her officer candidate school experience had yet to be spoken or taken. The fifth and final day of the capstone exercise dawned gray and drizzly, with low-hanging clouds that seemed to mirror the tense anticipation that had settled over the entire cadet class. This would be their ultimate test, a comprehensive scenario that would integrate every skill they had developed and every lesson they had learned over the past 10 weeks. More importantly, the performance evaluations from this final day would carry disproportionate weight in determining post-graduation assignments and career opportunities. Sarah woke before her alarm, her mind already racing through potential scenarios and strategies. The past 4 days had given her increasing confidence in her abilities, but she was also acutely aware that this final challenge would likely present obstacles and complications that would test her resilience and adaptability in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. The mission briefing was scheduled for 0600 hours, and as the cadets assembled in the main briefing room, there was an almost electric tension in the air. Sarah noticed that many of her fellow cadets looked as nervous as she felt, despite their attempts to project confidence and readiness. Staff Sergeant Williams took the podium with his characteristic no-nonsense demeanor, but Sarah detected something different in his expression, a seriousness that suggested this final exercise would be unlike anything they had previously encountered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Today's exercise will test your ability to function as Marine officers under conditions of maximum stress and uncertainty. You will face multiple, simultaneous challenges that will require you to make rapid decisions with incomplete information while maintaining focus on primary mission objectives." He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, revealing a complex map of a fictional Middle Eastern country torn by civil war and insurgent activity. The scenario, he explained, would place the cadets in the roles of Marine officers responsible for stabilizing a critical region while conducting humanitarian operations and training local security forces. What made this exercise particularly challenging was its structure. Rather than working in predetermined teams with assigned leadership roles, the cadets would be required to self-organize into functional units and establish their own command structure based on the demands of the evolving situation. Leadership positions would be fluid, changing as different phases of the operation required different types of expertise and decision-making. The scenario would unfold in real time over 12 hours, with new information and complications being introduced continuously. The cadets would have to adapt their strategies and reorganize their teams as circumstances changed, demonstrating their ability to maintain effectiveness under pressure while dealing with the kind of uncertainty and complexity they would face in actual combat operations. As Williams provided additional details about the exercise parameters and evaluation criteria, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for throughout her time at officer candidate school, an opportunity to demonstrate her leadership capabilities in a complex, demanding environment where success would depend on competence, adaptability, and the ability to work effectively with others. However, she was also aware that the self-organizing nature of the exercise could work against her. Without assigned leadership positions, she would need to establish her credibility and earn her role based on her contributions to the group's success. Given the patterns of dismissal and marginalization she had experienced throughout the program, she knew this would not be automatic or easy. The exercise began with the cadets being divided into 3 large groups, each responsible for a different geographic sector of the fictional country. Sarah found herself assigned to the group responsible for the northern region, an area characterized by mountainous terrain, ethnic tensions, and significant insurgent activity. As the group began to assess their situation and develop initial strategies, Sarah immediately noticed the familiar dynamics beginning to emerge. The male cadets who had held leadership positions throughout the program naturally gravitated toward decision-making roles, while the women and less assertive male cadets found themselves being assigned to supporting positions. Cadet Johnson, who had led Sarah's team during the first day of the capstone exercise, quickly positioned himself as the overall coordinator for the northern sector. His approach was to divide the region into smaller areas of responsibility and assign teams to handle specific aspects of the mission, security operations, humanitarian relief, and training of local forces. Sarah found herself initially assigned to the humanitarian relief team, a role that was important but that would once again limit her opportunities to demonstrate tactical leadership capabilities. As she listened to the planning discussions, she could see several strategic issues that weren't being adequately addressed, but the rapid pace of the exercise and the need to begin operations quickly meant there was limited time for detailed analysis and discussion. The humanitarian relief assignment placed her under the leadership of Maria Rodriguez, who had adopted a more collaborative leadership style since the difficulties she had experienced during the direct action scenario earlier in the week. Rodriguez was clearly making an effort to incorporate input from all team members and to ensure that everyone had opportunities to contribute meaningfully to the mission. However, even as Sarah began working on humanitarian relief planning, she found her attention drawn to broader strategic issues that she felt weren't being adequately considered by the overall sector coordination team. The northern region was characterized by complex tribal relationships and historical grievances that would significantly impact the effectiveness of any military or humanitarian operations. From her academic background and her observations during the exercise, Sarah understood that successful operations in this environment would require a sophisticated understanding of local political dynamics and careful coordination between military and civilian objectives. The approach being developed by Johnson's coordination team seemed to treat security, humanitarian, and training missions as separate, parallel efforts rather than as interconnected elements of a comprehensive strategy. As the exercise progressed through its first phase, the limitations of this compartmentalized approach became apparent. The security team was focusing on traditional counterinsurgency tactics that were generating resentment among the local population, while the humanitarian team was distributing aid in ways that were inadvertently exacerbating ethnic tensions. Meanwhile, the training team was working with local security forces without adequate understanding of their tribal affiliations and competing loyalties. Sarah could see that these problems were interconnected and that addressing them would require a more integrated approach to planning and execution. However, her position within the humanitarian relief team limited her ability to influence the overall strategy, and her attempts to raise these concerns through Rodriguez were not reaching the decision-makers in Johnson's coordination team. The situation came to a head during the third phase of the exercise, when a series of simulated incidents threatened to destabilize the entire northern sector. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent forces were planning to exploit the growing unrest caused by poorly coordinated military and humanitarian operations, while local tribal leaders were expressing increasing frustration with what they perceived as culturally insensitive and counterproductive American interventions. Johnson's response to these developing crises was to intensify security operations while temporarily suspending humanitarian activities that might be putting civilians at risk. From a purely tactical perspective, this approach made sense, but Sarah could see that it would likely accelerate the deterioration of local support and create additional opportunities for insurgent recruitment and activity. During a brief coordination meeting between team leaders, Sarah made the difficult decision to speak up about her concerns, even though doing so meant challenging the authority structure that had been established for the exercise. "I think we need to reconsider our overall approach," she said, addressing Johnson directly but speaking loudly enough for the other team leaders to hear. "The problems we're facing aren't separate tactical issues that can be solved independently. They're symptoms of a fundamental disconnect between our operations and the local political and cultural environment." Johnson's initial reaction was predictably dismissive. "Martinez, we don't have time for academic theorizing right now. We've got active threats that need immediate tactical responses." However, Rodriguez and several other team leaders appeared interested in Sarah's perspective, and they pressed for her to elaborate on her analysis. Sarah quickly outlined her assessment of the interconnected nature of the challenges they were facing and proposed an alternative approach that would integrate security, humanitarian, and training operations in ways that would address local concerns while still achieving their primary mission objectives. Her proposal involved repositioning security forces to work more closely with local tribal leaders, modifying humanitarian distribution methods to reduce ethnic tensions, and restructuring the training program to take advantage of existing tribal military traditions rather than imposing purely American approaches to warfare and security. The discussion that followed was intense and sometimes heated, with several male cadets arguing that Sarah's suggestions were too complex and time-consuming to implement under current pressure. However, other team members, including some who had been skeptical of her contributions in previous exercises, began to see the merit in her integrated approach. The debate was interrupted by the arrival of new intelligence indicating that the insurgent threat was more immediate and serious than previously understood. Enemy forces were apparently planning coordinated attacks on multiple targets within the northern sector, including the humanitarian relief distribution points that were currently being used by Sarah's team. The escalating threat forced Johnson to make rapid decisions about how to reorganize their operations and respond to the developing crisis. Under normal circumstances, Sarah suspected that he would have defaulted to a purely military response that emphasized force protection and tactical superiority over the more nuanced approach she had proposed. However, the time pressure and the complexity of the threat seemed to have opened him up to considering alternative strategies. "All right, Martinez," he said, his tone still skeptical but less dismissive than usual. "You seem to think you have a better understanding of what's going on here. How would your integrated approach handle this situation?" Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized that she was being given an opportunity to demonstrate her strategic thinking under exactly the kind of pressure that would characterize real combat leadership situations. She quickly outlined a response plan that would use the existing relationships with tribal leaders to gather intelligence about insurgent plans while repositioning security forces to protect humanitarian operations rather than simply suspending them. Her approach involved taking calculated risks that would demonstrate continued American commitment to helping the local population while creating opportunities to identify and neutralize insurgent threats. It was more complex than a purely defensive strategy, but it also offered the potential for much greater long-term success in achieving their overall mission objectives. The discussion continued for several more minutes, with other team leaders contributing refinements and modifications to Sarah's basic strategy. What surprised Sarah was how quickly the collaborative planning process began to generate insights and improvements that none of them would have developed independently. As the planning session concluded, Johnson made the decision to implement a modified version of Sarah's integrated approach. "We'll try it your way, Martinez," he said, though his tone still carried notes of skepticism. "But if this goes sideways, it's going to be on your head." The comment stung, but Sarah also recognized it as an opportunity. For the first time during officer candidate school, she was being given real responsibility for strategic decision-making under pressure. The outcome would demonstrate either her competence as a future Marine officer or her unsuitability for leadership responsibilities. The implementation of the new strategy required rapid reorganization of all teams within the northern sector, with Sarah taking on a coordinating role that was essentially equivalent to deputy sector commander. The position gave her authority to direct operations across all three mission areas: security, humanitarian, and training, in order to ensure effective integration of their efforts. Working with tribal leaders, Sarah's team was able to gather intelligence that revealed the insurgents' plans in much greater detail than previous methods had achieved. The information showed that the planned attacks were designed not just to inflict casualties, but to destroy the credibility of American forces by demonstrating their inability to protect the local population they claimed to be helping. Armed with this intelligence, Sarah coordinated a response that positioned security forces to intercept the insurgent attacks, while simultaneously using humanitarian operations as vehicles for gathering additional real-time information about enemy movements and intentions. The approach was risky because it potentially exposed civilian aid workers and recipients to danger, but it also created opportunities to neutralize threats before they could fully develop. The execution phase was intense and demanding, requiring constant communication and coordination between teams that were operating in different locations and facing different challenges. Sarah found herself managing multiple simultaneous operations while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances and new intelligence. When the first insurgent attack was attempted, Sarah's integrated approach proved its effectiveness. The combination of intelligence from tribal sources and tactical positioning based on comprehensive understanding of local dynamics allowed the security teams to neutralize the threat quickly and effectively, while humanitarian operations continued with minimal disruption. The success of the response had implications that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Local tribal leaders, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with American operations, expressed renewed confidence in the partnership. Community members who had been skeptical of humanitarian assistance began to actively support distribution efforts, providing additional security and intelligence that further enhanced operational effectiveness. As the exercise progressed through its final phases, the northern sector's integrated approach began to generate results that exceeded the objectives that had been established at the beginning of the day. Not only had they successfully countered the insurgent threats, but they had also established sustainable relationships with local partners that would continue to provide benefits long after American forces had departed. The success was particularly meaningful because it demonstrated Sarah's ability to develop and implement strategy under pressure while working effectively with team members who had previously been skeptical of her capabilities. The collaborative planning process had generated better results than any individual could have achieved alone, but Sarah's initial analysis and strategic framework had been essential to making that collaboration productive. However, even as Sarah felt pride in what they had accomplished, she was also aware that the exercise was being closely observed and evaluated by instructors whose assessments would determine her future opportunities within the Marine Corps. She had taken significant risks by challenging established authority structures and proposing alternative approaches, and she knew that not all of the evaluating officers would necessarily view her initiative positively. As the 12-hour exercise drew to its conclusion, Sarah found herself reflecting on how much her understanding of leadership and military effectiveness had evolved over the course of officer candidate school. The challenges she had faced had forced her to develop not just tactical and technical competencies, but also sophisticated awareness of organizational dynamics and the ability to navigate complex social and political environments. The final phase of the exercise concluded with a comprehensive after-action review that would determine not only individual cadet evaluations, but also the overall lessons learned that would inform future training programs. As the cadets prepared for this crucial assessment, Sarah felt a mixture of confidence in what she had accomplished and uncertainty about how her performance would be interpreted and valued by the Marine Corps leadership that would ultimately determine her career trajectory. What she couldn't have anticipated was that the most important moment of her entire officer candidate school experience was still ahead of her, and that the words that would change everything would come from someone she had barely noticed throughout the entire program. The foundations had been laid, the capabilities had been demonstrated, but the transformation that would define her future as a Marine officer was about to unfold in ways that would surprise everyone involved, including Sarah herself. The comprehensive after-action review began 3 hours after the conclusion of the capstone exercise, giving the cadets just enough time to clean their equipment and grab a quick meal before facing what many considered the most crucial evaluation of their entire officer candidate school experience. Sarah sat in the large briefing room, surrounded by her exhausted classmates, as Staff Sergeant Williams and a panel of senior officers prepared to deliver their assessments of the day's performance. The review process was systematic and thorough, with each sector's operations being analyzed in detail before moving on to broader lessons about leadership, decision-making, and military effectiveness. Sarah listened as the southern and central sectors presented their results, noting the similarities and differences in their approaches and outcomes compared to what her northern sector had accomplished. Both of the other sectors had achieved their basic objectives, but neither had demonstrated the kind of innovative problem-solving or adaptive leadership that had characterized the northern sector's integrated approach. Their operations had been competent and professional, but they had also been relatively conventional, following established doctrines and procedures rather than developing new solutions to complex challenges. When it came time for the northern sector to present their results, Johnson stood up to deliver the briefing on behalf of the entire team. Sarah felt a familiar knot in her stomach as she realized that he would likely present the day's successes in ways that emphasized his own leadership while minimizing her strategic contributions. Johnson's presentation was polished and professional, highlighting the sector's successful counterinsurgency operations and the positive relationships that had been established with local tribal leaders. He described their approach as adaptive leadership that responded effectively to changing circumstances and evolving threats, but he presented it as the result of collaborative decision-making rather than acknowledging the specific strategic framework that Sarah had developed. As Johnson continued his presentation, Sarah found herself struggling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was proud of what their team had accomplished and recognized that the success had indeed been the result of collaborative effort by everyone involved. On the other hand, she felt frustrated by the way her contributions were being minimized and absorbed into a generic narrative about teamwork and adaptation. The pattern felt depressingly familiar. Once again, her strategic thinking and leadership initiatives were being reframed as supporting elements in someone else's success story. While she received credit for competent performance in her assigned role, the innovative problem-solving and risk-taking that had made the difference between success and failure were being attributed to the team as a whole or to the official leadership structure. When Johnson concluded his presentation, the panel of evaluating officers began asking detailed questions about specific aspects of the northern sector's operations. Their questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of what had actually occurred during the exercise and suggested that they had been monitoring communications and decision-making processes throughout the day. Captain Morrison, who had participated in Sarah's earlier evaluation after the protocol violation incident, asked a particularly pointed question about the strategic framework that had guided the sector's integrated approach to security and humanitarian operations. Can you explain the analytical process that led to your decision to coordinate these traditionally separate mission areas? He asked. Johnson's response was vague and general, describing the decision as the natural result of recognizing the interconnected nature of their challenges. However, his answer lacked the specific details and theoretical foundation that would have demonstrated genuine understanding of the strategic principles involved. Captain Morrison's follow-up question revealed that he was not satisfied with Johnson's explanation. I'm interested in understanding how your team developed the specific intelligence-gathering approach that proved so effective in countering the insurgent threats. That level of cultural and political analysis doesn't typically emerge from standard tactical planning processes. Again, Johnson's response was somewhat superficial, emphasizing the team's collective effort and their commitment to thinking creatively about complex problems. While his answers weren't incorrect, they also weren't particularly insightful or informative about the actual decision-making process that had led to their success. It was at this point that an unexpected voice entered the conversation. Lance Corporal Marcus Thompson, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room throughout the review process, stood up and requested permission to address the panel. Sir, I observed the northern sector's operations throughout the day, and I think there are some important details about their strategic development process that haven't been adequately covered in the presentation. Staff Sergeant Williams looked surprised by Thompson's intervention, but he nodded for the Lance Corporal to continue. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she wondered what Thompson was planning to say and whether his comments would help or hurt her position. Thompson walked to the front of the room with the confident bearing that Sarah had observed during their previous interactions. Despite his junior rank relative to the evaluating officers, he commanded attention through his obvious competence and his reputation for insightful analysis of cadet performance. The strategic framework that guided the Northern Sector's success was developed primarily by Cadet Martinez, Thompson said, his voice clear and authoritative. Her analysis of the interconnected nature of security, humanitarian, and training challenges provided the foundation for everything that followed. Sarah felt a shock of surprise and gratitude as Thompson continued his analysis. He described her contributions in specific detail, explaining how her initial strategic assessment had identified the fundamental problems with the compartmentalized approach and how her alternative framework had enabled the effective integration of multiple mission areas. Cadet Martinez's approach demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptive leadership and strategic thinking that we need in Marine officers operating in complex environments, Thompson continued. She identified problems that others had missed, developed innovative solutions under pressure, and then successfully coordinated the implementation of those solutions across multiple teams and mission areas. As Thompson spoke, Sarah noticed that the evaluating officers were listening with obvious interest and taking detailed notes. Captain Morrison, in particular, seemed focused on understanding the specific contributions that Thompson was describing. What impressed me most, Thompson said, was Cadet Martinez's ability to challenge existing approaches while still working collaboratively with her team members. She didn't just identify problems, she provided practical solutions and then worked to implement them effectively even when some people were initially skeptical of her ideas. Thompson's presentation continued for several more minutes, providing detailed analysis of Sarah's performance throughout not just the final day's exercise, but also her contributions during previous training scenarios. He described patterns of strategic thinking and leadership initiative that Sarah hadn't even realized were being observed and evaluated. In my opinion, Thompson concluded, Cadet Martinez has demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership potential and strategic competence that should be recognized and developed. Her performance throughout Officer Candidate School has consistently exceeded standards, and her contributions during today's exercise showed the kind of innovation and adaptability that will be essential for future Marine operations. The silence that followed Thompson's presentation was profound. Sarah could feel every eye in the room focused on her, and she struggled to process the emotional impact of having her contributions recognized and advocated for so powerfully and publicly. Captain Morrison was the first to break the silence. Cadet Martinez, would you please stand and provide your own assessment of the strategic framework that Lance Corporal Thompson has described? Sarah rose slowly, her mind racing as she tried to organize her thoughts and present them in a way that would be both honest and professionally appropriate. She had not expected to be asked to present her own analysis, and she was acutely aware that her response would be crucial in determining how her performance was ultimately evaluated. Sir, the approach we developed was based on recognizing that in complex operational environments, traditional distinctions between security, humanitarian, and training missions can become counterproductive, Sarah began, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing. Local populations don't compartmentalize their experiences the way our doctrine sometimes suggests we should organize our operations. She continued by explaining the specific analytical framework she had used to assess the situation and develop alternative strategies. Her presentation was detailed and thoughtful, demonstrating not just what she had done, but also why she had made specific decisions and how those decisions had contributed to the overall success of their operations. As Sarah spoke, she noticed that several of her fellow cadets were looking at her with expressions she had not seen before, expressions that seemed to combine surprise, respect, and perhaps some reevaluation of their previous assumptions about her capabilities and potential. When she concluded her presentation, Captain Morrison asked several follow-up questions that tested her understanding of the broader implications of her approach and her ability to apply similar thinking to other scenarios. Sarah's responses demonstrated not only tactical competence, but also strategic vision and the kind of adaptive thinking that would be valuable in the rapidly changing operational environments that characterized modern military operations. The formal evaluation session continued for another hour, with other cadets presenting their analyses and receiving feedback from the panel of evaluating officers. However, Sarah found it difficult to focus on these subsequent presentations because she was still processing the impact of Thompson's advocacy and the opportunity she had been given to articulate her own strategic thinking. As the evaluation session concluded, Staff Sergeant Williams announced that individual performance assessments would be delivered privately over the next 2 days, followed by the final graduation ceremony and the announcement of post-graduation assignments. The cadets were dismissed to return to their barracks and prepare for the final phase of their officer candidate school experience. As Sarah walked out of the briefing room, she was approached by several of her fellow cadets who wanted to discuss the day's events and her presentation. For the first time throughout the entire program, she found herself engaged in conversations where her ideas and perspectives were being sought out and valued rather than dismissed or ignored. Maria Rodriguez was particularly effusive in her praise. "I had no idea you had developed such a comprehensive analysis of the operational environment," she said. "I wish I had pushed harder to get your input incorporated into our earlier planning discussions." Even more surprisingly, Cadet Johnson approached her with what appeared to be genuine respect and perhaps some embarrassment about his previous dismissiveness. "Martinez, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on following standard procedures that I missed the bigger picture you were seeing. Your approach made all the difference today." However, it was Thompson's intervention that continued to occupy Sarah's thoughts as she returned to her barracks that evening. She had not expected anyone in authority to advocate for her so powerfully and specifically, and she was grateful beyond words for his recognition of her contributions. The next morning, Sarah was summoned to meet with Captain Morrison for her individual performance assessment. As she walked to his office, she felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness about what this conversation would reveal about her future prospects as a Marine officer. Captain Morrison's office was decorated with mementos from his own career, including photos from various deployments and awards recognizing his service and leadership. He invited Sarah to sit down and then spent several minutes reviewing her file before beginning their conversation. "Cadet Martinez," he began, "your performance throughout Officer Candidate School has been exemplary in most measurable categories. Your academic scores are in the top 5% of your class, your physical fitness performance has been consistently excellent, and your technical competence across all training areas has met or exceeded all standards." Sarah felt a surge of relief and pride at this assessment, but she also sensed that there was more to come. "However," Captain Morrison continued, "what has impressed me most about your performance is your demonstrated ability to think strategically and to develop innovative solutions to complex problems. Yesterday's exercise provided clear evidence of the kind of leadership potential that the Marine Corps needs to develop and utilize effectively." He explained that her performance during the capstone exercise had demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptive leadership and strategic thinking that would be essential for Marine officers operating in the complex operational environments of the 21st century. "Based on your overall performance, and particularly your demonstration of strategic leadership capabilities, I am recommending you for assignment to the Marine Expeditionary Unit Program, with a specialty track in operations planning and strategic coordination." The assignment was exactly what Sarah had hoped for but had not dared to expect. The Marine Expeditionary Unit Program was one of the most prestigious and challenging assignments available to new officers, providing opportunities for rapid professional development and exposure to high-level operational planning and execution. "However," Captain Morrison added, "I want you to understand that this recommendation is based not just on your technical competence, but also on your demonstrated ability to challenge existing approaches and develop new solutions when circumstances require it. The Marine Corps needs officers who can think independently and adapt to changing conditions, even when that means questioning established procedures or hierarchies." As Sarah left Captain Morrison's office, she reflected on how profoundly her understanding of herself and her place in the Marine Corps had evolved over the course of Officer Candidate School. She had entered the program focused primarily on proving that she belonged and that she could meet all stated standards and requirements. Through the challenges and obstacles she had faced, she had discovered not only her own capabilities but also her responsibility to contribute her unique perspectives and abilities to the broader mission of the Marine Corps. The recognition and support she had received from Thompson and ultimately from the evaluation panel had shown her that excellence and innovation were valued, even when they came from unexpected sources. The graduation ceremony took place 3 days later, with Sarah's family in attendance to witness her commissioning as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. As she stood with her fellow new officers, receiving her gold bars and taking her oath of office, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment and the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The words that Lance Corporal Thompson had spoken during the evaluation session continued to echo in her mind. Words that had changed everything by recognizing and validating her contributions when she had begun to doubt whether her efforts were making any difference. Those words had not only affected her own career prospects, but had also demonstrated that the Marine Corps could be an institution where merit and innovation were ultimately recognized and rewarded, regardless of who provided them. As Sarah looked toward her future as a Marine officer, she understood that she would continue to face challenges and obstacles related to both gender dynamics and institutional culture. However, she also knew that she had allies and advocates who recognized her value and would support her efforts to contribute meaningfully to the Marine Corps mission. The transformation was complete, but the journey was just beginning. The cadet who had once been dismissed and marginalized had become an officer whose strategic thinking and leadership potential were recognized and valued. The words that had changed everything had opened doors to opportunities that would allow her to prove, again and again, that her place in the Marine Corps was not just deserved, but essential to its success in an increasingly